Is scheduling sex a thing? I was inspired by some conversation in the Facebook group, and I wanted to comment on this because I think in popular media and society, there can be a lot of resistance to scheduling sex. And I would like to share that scheduling sex is actually a thing. It does have a caveat to it that I want to explain, but it can be supportive in some relationships. Now, in media and in common society, there's this idea that having sex should be spontaneous and that it's always lusty and full of passion. That chemistry is building and firing. And yes, that does absolutely happen, right? And especially when you start to come into a new relationship, that can be where it does sometimes tend to flow a little bit easier, and that's what's known as the honeymoon period. I personally don't believe in a honeymoon period. I think it's a falsity, and that any couple or partnership that wants to keep that level of intimacy can do so through intentional practices. That's a topic for another time. But what tends to happen is that it perpetuates this idea that sex always needs to be spontaneous and when both of you are in the moment and things like that. And that tends to be, easier when things are flowing really well. When things aren't flowing really well, maybe you're feeling some resistance towards your partner. Maybe stress is going up in your life. Maybe you have to work a lot. Maybe there's other outside pressures to do with your time and your energy. Then the reality is that the opportunity and the spaces for that spontaneity to come through become few and far between, which then starts to lead to, well, if sex is something that's important, if having intimacy with your partner or with yourself, I definitely want to emphasize having intimacy with yourself, whether you're single or in a partnership. If that is something that you're interested in, that you're starting to explore as a priority, then making time and space for that is actually really important. So scheduling can sound like quite a formal sort of business kind of word, but I would invite you to perhaps reframe this and think of it like, I'm creating time and space to connect in with my sexuality, to feel intimate with my partner. Now, there is a caveat with this, a really, really important one, and that relates to pressure, because all pressure will kill libido, right? If we feel like there's any pressure, or you feel like you're being forced or kind of coerced into something, then it will immediately shut down your body, especially because it starts to register it as a threat, okay, and not necessarily a real physical threat, but an emotional threat on some level. And that's where some of this resistance can come in, like, well, I don't want to schedule sex because then it feels inauthentic and it doesn't kind of flow. And reframing this can start to help it. And I would also suggest, like, get honest and realistic with how much space your lifestyle actually allows for you to be intimate, right? If you have a lifestyle that has lots of space and time, then you probably might not need to schedule sex so much. If you have a busy life, then yes, this is a helpful tool. Okay, so going back to the caveat of the pressure. So if it's like, okay, you're scheduling sex, okay, I call it date night. But if you're creating that space with yourself or with your partner, I also date myself. I have a whole evening that I date myself every week, and I have a whole evening that I date my partner once a week. Now, if there is an underlying pressure for that to have to lead to sex, then that can start to create anxiety, a resistance to showing up. So my suggestion to you is, how can it be a space that you create together that's intentional, that's intimate, and also leave space for anything to unfold that needs to unfold? i.e., it could be that you're just lying in bed talking. It could be that that does lead to sex, and that's great, but it doesn't necessarily have to, right? But there is some intentionality around wanting to connect and wanting to find intimacy. And so that's how I would reframe scheduling sex. I would perhaps suggest it to be creating time and space to be intimate and connected. Yeah. And then if you are really interested in wanting to explore sex in those spaces, I would say that having some other practices to do that build intimacy, yeah, like, so for example, it could be sitting opposite your partner and doing some breathing together. Yeah, it could be sitting opposite your partner and doing some eye gazing. So, literally, just looking into your partner's eyes. Yeah, because intimacy and connection actually leads to sex. Yeah, so you can start to bring in some of these practices as a couple or with yourself. So, this could also be a self pleasure practice without the goal or the pressure of having to orgasm or having to get turned on, right? It could be that you just want to stroke your body for half an hour, or you want to dance around your room feeling really sexy. Okay, that's all a beautiful practice, intentional space. And so if you start to bring in some of these practices, if you're starting to look at wanting to get more turned on and wanting to have more sex, then start with practices that aren't sex, right? And that focus on intimacy, focus on connection. And then as that starts to build, this desire for sex and physicality will just naturally start to unfold from there. Yeah. I think if you're going to start creating these intentional spaces with your partner, I would encourage you to have a conversation openly about this and say, and if this is true for you, hey, I'm actually scared, or I have a fear that if we start creating these spaces or date nights together, then there's an underlying expectation it's going to lead to sex. And as soon as you put that out on the table and you start to communicate that with your partner, it's like it magically starts to dissolve that tension, because fear, whether a subconscious or conscious, leads to tension in the body, right? And tension in the body is never a good idea when you're wanting to be intimate or have sex. So, to sum up that, yes, sex can be spontaneous and beautiful. If you have a lifestyle that allows for that, then go for it. If you don't have a lifestyle that allows for that, or you feel like the spark is gone between your partner, setting intentional spaces, time and space to connect and be intimate can be really effective for your relationship. And then the caveat in here is get really, really clear on if there's any underlying pressure to have that lead to sex and what you want to do in those spaces with yourself or with your partner. That can focus on intimacy and connection first, and then from there, that'll start to unfold into turn on and physicality.